In this lecture, we're going to talk more about the Aristotelian Appeals and visual arguments, especially as we are thinking about how visual arguments work to appeal to viewers, especially in terms of making them interested in the product that's being advertised or to agree with the point that's being emphasized. So it's really important to consider why the Aristotelian Appeals are important. So the Aristotelian Appeals are really important for arguments because they're really centered on the audience and how we're constructing an argument in order to appeal specifically to that audience. So they're means of persuasion. We can't just present an argument, or especially a visual argument, without considering how it's working, how it's functioning to be persuasive for the specific audience. The first of the Aristotelian appeals is pathos. Pathos is an emotional appeal. It's really working in order to trigger the emotions in the viewers or in the readers, because of course, when we think about emotions, a lot of people are emotionally driven and of course can make decisions based on how they feel about a specific issue, a specific situation, or even a certain product. So when we think about how authors work to appeal to pathos, really in written arguments, it's really centered on words or passages that are designed to trigger an emotional response. This emotional response can be positive, like love, excitement, or it could be negative, like anger, sympathy, fear. When it comes to visual arguments, on the other hand, it can also be really centered on how images are selected or strategically placed in order to emphasize this emotional response in viewers. So we really want to consider how that image is framed and, of course, the specific choice within that visual argument. So take, for example, this advertisement. So if we think of this advertisement, Moms Demand Action, really we have to think about the image. So we have this picture of two children sitting next to each other, one holding a book entitled Little Red Riding Hood, the other one is holding a gun. So if we think about this image, it would catch the viewer's attention, and we could analyze basically how it's framed. So if we think about it, we can think about how using children in this image creates more of an emotional response. If this picture showed adults, then there would be a very different feeling associated with it. We wouldn't be so emotionally affected. If you think about children in advertising and visual arguments in general, children are really effective in terms of using and creating an emotional appeal because, of course, we as a society want to protect children as much as possible. If we notice this even more, it's paired with the text at the top. So one child is holding something that's been banned in America to protect them. Guess which one? So thinking about this, it makes you wonder and kind of what is basically what is the child being protected from? If we look at the text at the bottom of the visual argument, we keep Little Red Riding Hood out of schools because of the bottle of wine in her basket. Why not assault weapons? So it's really emphasizing the point and the main argument here, which is to ban guns in schools, and using Little Red Riding Hood as a comparison and emphasizing that specifically with the children. So if we think about that emotional appeal, we could even get into how it has the classroom in the background to even more emphasize this point and create that emotional response. This next example of an advertisement is for Ford car company especially. So one thing to note here is it's not clarifying which car model it's advertising for. So we have to really decipher kind of why it's creating this argument specifically. So if we notice, the first thing that catches your eye as a viewer is this dog. So the dog is very strategic. If we think about a lot of advertisements that uses animals, we usually do this in order to make us feel guilty. Probably the primary example would probably be the ASPCA commercial with Sarah McLachlan's Eyes of an Angel, in which it has the pictures of sad dogs looking at you to make you feel guilty and you want to especially donate or adopt. So dogs can be and animals in general, very effective in terms of appealing to the emotions of a viewer. So if you look about how this dog is poised, it's poised with its one arm out towards presumably the camera. So that, as body language is presenting this dog as kind of begging you for something or asking for something, if we look further into this image, what we can notice is in the top left-hand corner, there's a little image that looks like the car rear camera, so the car bumper. So if we think about that tied in with what's written next to the dog, so that our little friends become more visible, forward rear view camera, we can see how it's creating that argument in terms of you should want to buy Ford because their rear view camera will help you protect dogs so you won't accidentally run them over. So this as an emotional response is going to make you feel especially guilty. So if you don't have a rear camera, then you would be guilty and you'd be worried about this. Therefore, you're going to be more likely to want to purchase it to avoid those negative feelings. When we shift to the appeal to logos, which is of course logic appeals, this really changes in terms of how we view the different argument and of course the different strategies that go into creating that argument. Authors specifically use the appeal to logos when they're presenting reasons and of course making the argument itself the reasonable choice. So if we think about it, that's really centered on organization. It's really centered on how evidence is being presented that's relevant specifically for the argument. So common ways that we see different arguments, whether written or visual arguments appealing to logos, would be the use of statistics, especially if they're from a credible or trustworthy source, the use of facts, recorded evidence, even historical data, and sometimes they even mention specific studies or surveys just to back up the individual points that are being made. So if we look at this first example, this is from betterfuture.org, and of course we have really large there, poverty knows no age, and in smaller text right below it, it says 1 out of 30 kids are suffering from poverty in the US alone. So this is appealing to logos through that number 1 out of 30 kids. So if we think about that, that is pretty frequent. 1 out of 30 is not necessarily rare. So that is going to make it logical in terms of fighting and donating to this foundation in order to help kids live outside of poverty. And of course, leave poverty, be more comfortable and more secure in their living situation. And of course, even with food and not have to deal with food insecurity. So that statistic is really telling. And of course, we could even see how this appeals to pathos through the use of that little girl staring at the camera so that it's making that connection even more. So if that data isn't enough, it can use that emotional appeal to make it stronger. Next, we have this from the Department of Transportation. So if we think about how this is framed, we don't have statistics, but we do have the organization. So the text at the top of this advertisement reads, "Some things don't add up." So that is really telling us how we're supposed to interpret the images below. So we have the image of a front of a car, we have a plus sign, we have a bottle, and then we have drunk driving. So if we're thinking about how this is progressing, it's presenting those images so we make the logical connection to driving plus drinking equals drunk driving. So that's something that we should avoid, we shouldn't do. We could argue that this could have a stronger logical appeal by having statistics or having some studies or whatever, depending on what would benefit the audience. Next, we have this image here. So if we look at this, it's from Ugly Truth, so the McCann Healthcare Worldwide. At the very top, we have your beauty up in smoke. So if we think about that, that's telling us how we should look at this image. So even though this image is not presenting specifically statements, through the comparison between the two sides of her face and the connection to the cigarette in her hand, we can see the connection, the logic that this visual argument is using. So on the side of her face that is not covered in smoke, it's showing her youthful skin. On the other side, where the smoke is covering her face, she is more wrinkled, her hair is turned gray. So it's making that argument through this comparison that smoking will cause you to age more quickly. And that's even stronger if you look at the very bottom of this visual argument where it says, tobacco will destroy your face cell by cell from the inside out. That's the ugly truth. So it's really breaking down that reasoning and that cause and effect in making this argument. Our last appeal is an appeal to ethos. So when we're thinking about the Aristotelian appeal of ethos, that is really an appeal to the audience using credibility. So we want the arguments to be as trustworthy as possible. So in terms of how an author works to appeal to ethos, they really focus on convincing the audience of the credibility of that author or of the organization that's creating the visual argument. So when we're creating that credibility, when we're establishing that, we really want to think of, okay, so what would the audience find to be credible? Who is an authority that they would trust, or somebody that is likable or respected? Or what are credible resources and references that I could use to really back up the argument that I'm making? When we think about visual arguments specifically, advertisements often use images or quotes from well-known celebrities, as well as statistics from trusted organizations to really work on appealing to ethos. Take, for example, this ad for Aveeno. So if we think about the celebrity used in this ad, we have Jennifer Aniston. So because she is well known, people tend to trust her more, especially if we think about her run as Rachel Green on Friends. So of course, people look up to her and they're making that connection that because she is basically a spokesperson for this product, we should trust this product if we trust her. And if we think of like how that is emphasized, if we look at the text on this advertisement, it has that question, what's my advice for healthy looking, radiant skin? So the use of my is presenting that she is the one talking. So even though this is print advertisement, it's presenting it as though she is giving this argument to you. And then she has that answer that presumably she would say a good night's sleep and Aveeno. One thing to note in terms of advertisements, specifically visual advertisements that use celebrities, typically they don't just rely on having that celebrity as the spokesperson, they still need to prove why it's good. So if you look at the smaller text on that screen, we have Aveeno Positively Radiant SPF 15 Face Moisturizer helps reduce the look of brown spots and uneven tone in just 4 weeks. It's clinically proven. Active Naturals formula has soy, one of nature's most effective skin tone correctors. Sleep on that. So there we have more information about the product to really emphasize why it is a good product that the consumer should buy. And our last example, we have this CoverGirl advertisement. So we have Zendaya. So fans of this actress as well as singer would be more interested in this product because they would trust her. And of course, it's presenting that connection of if she uses that product, and then I should use that product as well as a consumer. So if you think about it, easy breezy, beautiful. So it's really simple in terms of how it's creating that argument. And it's really centered on a close-up of her face so that we can really see her lashes to really emphasize it. So this image specifically isn't appealing to the audience in any other way. It's only focusing on that appeal to ethos. An important thing to note for any visual argument that you're analyzing is typically we want to try to appeal to all three of the Aristotelian appeals, but depending on the argument you're making, sometimes you do have to prioritize one or two over the other ones. It really is relative depending on the argument that's being made.